Let's welcome Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. قالت الأعراب آمنا قل لم تؤمنوا ولكن قولوا أسلمنا ولما يدخل الإيمان في قلوبكم وإن تطيعوا الله ورسوله لا يلتكم من أعمالكم شيئا إن الله غفور رحيم. إنما المؤمنون الذين آمنوا بالله ورسوله ثم لم يرتابوا وجاهدوا بأموالهم وأنفسهم في سبيل الله أولئك هم الصادقون. قل أتعلمون الله بدينكم والله يعلم ما في السماوات وما في الأرض والله بكل شيء عليم. يمنون عليك أن أسلموا قل لا تمنوا علي إسلامكم بل الله يمن عليكم أن هداكم للإيمان إن كنتم صادقين. إن الله يعلم غيب السماوات والأرض والله بصير بما تعملون. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very, very much for that recitation. We're now very fortunate to have Dr. Zainab Mai-Bornu, who will be speaking to us on the topic of decolonizing knowledge production on Africa, why it's still necessary and what can be done. Let's welcome her with Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Dr. Zainab is a lecturer in international politics at the University of Leicester, and we're very fortunate to have her here.
I normally stand, but I will sit no problem when I teach. It is a pleasure for me to be here, to be amongst my brothers and sisters, to have an opportunity to talk to you about my research. And what I'll try to do today is that I'll break it down. So I'll make sure it's not too academic, not technical. So break it down just so that you understand what I talk about when I talk about decolonizing knowledge production. So in terms of research, I do research on Africa. I look at the issues of conflict. No worries. Thank you. So I am into conflict, so I look at the dynamics of choice between violence and non-violence in terms of why people take up arms to fight maybe the state, among other things, and I look at the issues of inequalities. I look at development, so I narrow down also on women, and I argue that the voices of women are very important, especially when we talk about the peace and conflict issues affecting the world. I'm from Africa, I'm from Nigeria. My country is always engaged in one cycle of violent conflict or another. So I argue perhaps the policymakers, the leaders should learn from some of the activities the local women groups are doing in terms of, conflict resolution. So today I'm going to share with you a paper that my colleagues Gordon Crawford and Carl Landstrom, my PhD student, three of us published this paper on decolonizing knowledge production, why it is necessary. So when we talk about decolonizing knowledge, I think it has to do with the importance of Africans, for example, telling their own story as against, the Western-centric gaze, where you have the Western scholars residing here in the West and then writing about Africa. Going back to the issues of colonialism, Africa was colonized by most of the Western countries, and a lot of legacies are still evident in Africa. For the Africans amongst us here, going back, for example, we speak English in my country. Why not one of the local African languages as, the language of communication? So these are all issues that we talk about. So in terms of the issue of decolonizing knowledge, this goes back, to the time of independence in the 1960s, led by key Pan-Africanists in the name of Kwame Nkrumah, who upon, getting the opportunity of traveling to the West, learning, more about, freedom, amongst other things. So he, along with other Pan-Africanists like Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, led the charge in terms of fighting for the independence of Africa. And from the time Ghana was the first country that gained its independence, so Nkrumah led a lot of, ideas. He advocated for the importance of decolonizing the mind, okay? Free from domination and control by the West. And so when we talk about decolonizing knowledge production, it is all about the recognition and acknowledgement of the diverse forms of knowledge that are spread across the world. A lot of scholars have done work on this, so we are talking people like De Souza Santos, Achille Mbembe, Ndlovu Gatsheni, Luisa Enria, and so on, Amina Mama. There are so many people that are working on decolonizing knowledge production. Claude Ake, for example, is another person. So there are several perspectives when we talk about, knowledge production. It is about disrupting the norms, that are consistently engaged with when we tell stories, for example, about Africa and, some of these, the developing world as they refer to us. So it is about the relationship between decoloniality and liberation in Africa, emphasizing the need to move away from, knowledge that is produced by the West and imposed on others, as against a bottom-up approach where the Africans, should be able to tell their story. So within the context of Africa, there are these arguments that Africa was discovered by the white man, but we argue that no, Africa has always existed. Going back to arguments raised by scholars like Hegel that argue that Africa had no place in history, so there is nothing important to study when we talk about Africa. But over the years, African scholars argued for the importance of African history. So when talking about Africa, you need to, go back to the history of Africa. So pre-Africa, pre-colonialism, the traditional African society, because at that time, Africa had its own traditional system before the coming of even the Arab slave trades, okay? Slave traders, before we had the famous transatlantic slave trade that all of us feel very strongly about when we talk about. So Africa constitutes a rich site of new knowledges and ways of knowing and being that have the capacity to inform and transform theory in the North, to subvert its universalisms in order to rewrite them in a different, less provincial register. So here we talk about, in our paper, we talk about the importance of decolonizing knowledge production. It is not a new concept. It is something that has, from independence, from going back to Kwame Nkrumah, the Pan-Africanism, the movement led by some of these revolutionary leaders, in terms of Africa for Africa, the importance of Africa. So I included a link to our paper. If you have time, please read. I know it's academic, but I think we tried our best to even make it in a simplified way, break it down so that people that read our paper. So like I said, these are not new debates going back to Nkrumah, but the focus of our paper is on the implications of the current decolonization debates for research and knowledge production in Africa. And as we go along towards the end, I'm going to give you an example of how myself as a scholar is trying my best to use a methodology that I believe is a decolonial way of producing knowledge, especially those of us that do research and working with women. We asked why decolonization of knowledge production remains so necessary and what can be done within the context of scholarly research in the humanities and social sciences. So that is the focus of my work, not like the core sciences. And we address these questions at two different levels, one on a more practical level and one more reflective. And in both cases, the argument is that the issues of power inequalities and injustice are critical. Colonial practices of power and domination exist in Africa. This production of knowledge still takes place within historically determined as well as ongoing asymmetrical relations of power. And most of that which is received as knowledge about Africa is produced in the West. We argue that why should this be the case? We don't want, the Western scholars to tell us, this is your problem, this is your history. Africa, storytelling is very important for us in Africa. Why not use the storytellers to write the history of Africa? But now, at least, I'm happy to say that we have scholars that are doing a lot when it comes to knowledge on Africa. So two important initiatives at that time in the 1960s that Kwame Nkrumah did was the establishment of an Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana in 1961. And also the invitation he extended to Dubois, one of the people that shaped his own thinking in terms of the Pan-African thought, the importance of Africa, the importance of decolonization, trying, educating people like Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, among others, the importance of understanding, studying the concept of freedom that exists in the Western world and going back home to educate the people, to explain to them the importance of trying to get rid of the colonial masters. And this was something that was really very difficult and challenging because the former colonial masters made sure that Pan-African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah were labeled as, as the outlaws so much, and they were the architects of so many of the, coup attempts, coup plots that happened in Africa. Countries like France, for example, are guilty of these issues. So Dubois played a very big role. So in the contemporary world, scholars like Claude Ake, in his book, calls for the decolonization of the social sciences in Africa. He argues that Africa has been reduced to raw material production and Europe specializes in the production of capital goods. So the argument he raises is that, and other scholars, that Africa has been reduced just like to a continent, that produces a lot of data. So the scholars sometimes they go or they even use Africans in producing, in generating the data, and then they go back, process the data that they get. And it is interesting for those of you that maybe are, interested in academics, when you read some of these journal articles or some of these books, you find out that the voices, you wonder whose voices are being, amplified even in some of these articles that you read. So it is that of the Western scholars that are using Africa just, not as a productive place, but more one that they go down to get the data. And we argue that it is important to decolonize knowledge production because there is a lot of injustice in terms of unequal access to resources and opportunities between scholars from the South and from the global North. Because even in terms of getting published, so now let me go back to the academia in terms of unequal access. Scholars based in Africa, the majority don't have access to, world-class facilities, a lot of the scholarly materials that you read to even build your research on, you use in making your arguments or counter-arguments. And sometimes when these African scholars, they write, okay, language is a problem. We're not English speakers. English is not our first language. We all have our local languages. And the way the African style of writing is different from the way they do it here, although many are learning. But you find out that in terms of opportunity to even publish, the African scholar will write and send maybe to an international journal, but in most cases, they are rejected and knocked off because of the issue of language. So, in terms of access to even these resources, there are issues. There is also the issue of epistemic injustice and the question of whose knowledge counts, with many voices and perspectives remaining unheard and unrecognized, especially those from less powerful institutions and marginalized communities. Marginalized communities, I can talk about women groups, for example. So when you read, those of us that are into decolonizing knowledge production, we argue whose voice is being heard. Is it the voice of the scholar that is writing or the people affected? So we think about ways, to go about disrupting, the norms in terms of whose voice is being heard. Because when you read the article, maybe you get this interview saying, oh, I interviewed XYZ, or even on anonymous basis, this person said this or that person said that. But for someone like me, I argue for using decolonized methodologies more in a participatory way that will give power to the people that you are working with, so the participants are important. And we argue that it is the voice of those people, for example, for me, women that are impacted by the oil conflict in Nigeria, it is their voices, their stories that should be heard, not only myself as a scholar or another colleague that is working on this. So we talk about scholarly privilege and still link all these issues to coloniality and epistemic injustice. Scholars like Ndlovu Gasheni describe this as the myths of decolonization and the continued impact of the colonial matrix of power. He argues that the end of direct colonial rule did not lead to an independent African post-colonial world, instead to a post-colonial neo-colonized world. So we argue, yes, African countries are independent, but more and more, you see that the issue of neocolonialism is still going on. There are arguments that countries like China, when they give aid to Africa, why is it that, even from the West and countries like China, they regard Africa more in terms of aid? Africa is one of the richest countries in the world. We have a lot of resources. We're so rich, and yet we're so poor. Why is the focus more in terms of the benefits, in terms of the resources that some of these, aid donors get, as against, the development of Africa? Why shouldn't Africa be the one to chart, the course of, yes, this is what we want, and this is how we want to even, use our own resources? So these are the issues that we argue about in our work. And in terms of what can be done, a lot has been done. Scholars like Francis Yamjo, Aro Osegbe, Heleta, and so many others, argue for using the humanities and social sciences as a way of decolonizing knowledge production in the academia. And there are so many calls. So we argue that practical measures are needed to increase the representation of African-based scholars in scholarly knowledge production, thus as a way of countering asymmetries and current injustices, and a more fundamental reorientation of how knowledge is produced and the nature of knowledge on Africa, seeking to address current epistemic injustice. So here I will talk about this concept of rethinking thinking as advocated by Ndlovu Gasheni. So for scholars, we argue that when you do research on countries like Africa, for example, you need to question yourself continuously. Whose voice is being heard? Am I being as objective as I can? Am I targeting the right, resources when it comes to, getting the voices heard? The more thinking you do in the process of conducting your research will will give you an opportunity to be sort of, trying to move away from the norm, especially those of us that do comparative approaches. So liberating, the process of comparison, for example, moving away from the norm, trying to bring in something new, but more, participant-centered, giving them the power. We are thinking more towards the issue of epistemic justice. We maintain that decolonizing knowledge entails the need to take a step back and critically re-examine strategies that would disrupt the norms in terms of how knowledge is produced within our view of the world and the space we occupy within it. To unsettle the paradigm, we have to rethink thinking, as I said, by Ndlovu Gatsheni, which is more about shifting the geography of reason and entails a number of decolonial moves. So what are these, decolonial moves that we talk about? So I'll give you an example very soon. And in our work, we relied a lot of, in terms of the work of Linda Smith, for example, in terms of decolonization entailing deconstruction and reconstruction. We argue for a decolonial methodology framework in research, which is more than a political goal. We look at it more as a goal of social justice expressed through and across a wide range of psychological, social, cultural, and economic terrains. So I'll give you an example of my work. In my research, I use participatory video. And this is a picture of myself with some of my participants in the Niger Delta of Nigeria. So a little about my research. This is a project that was funded by the ESRC, the UK-based Economic and Social Research Council, titled Bringing Women's Voices Back in Gender and Oil Conflict in the Niger Delta. This came about as a result of my PhD, in which I focused on the dynamics of choice between nonviolence and violence. And one of the key findings of my work, because I engaged with the leaders of the Ogoni and the Ijaw movements in Nigeria. So for those of you that are aware of resource conflicts, maybe some of you must have heard about Ken Saro-Wiwa, some of you must have heard about the Niger Delta, the oil-rich area in Nigeria, a region that is responsible for over 90% of the revenue that accrues to the Nigerian state. But when you go, you see that development is not commensurate enough, and the communities are not happy. They are aggrieved, and they decided to engage the Nigerian state, some using non-violence, for example, Ken Saro-Wiwa, as advocated by Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and then others trying to mirror the Ogoni model. But the fact that the Nigerian state is one that uses force, to quell everything, they decided to, match fire for fire, as some of the reformed militants said to me. So one of the key findings is that they referred a lot to their women. Our women did this, our women were at the forefront of the nonviolent, demonstrations, among other things. And I kept saying to them, so where are the women? You're here telling me our women did this, our women did that, but you've not given me an opportunity to speak to them. I am a Nigerian, but an outsider. I'm not from the Niger Delta. I'm from the northern part of Nigeria. So I decided to apply for funding, and I was lucky to go back to the Niger Delta and to work with the women in the region. But working with the women is one that, and the women, I mean not women at the high level, but women at the local level, women at the grassroots level, those that are impacted directly with the, environmental degradation issues, among other things, And I decided to ask, what are the conflict-related experiences of the Ogoni and Ijaw women? What future roles could the women in the Niger Delta play to advance the nonviolence agenda? So I decided to use participatory video because the emphasis, as Linda Smith taught me, is in which knowledge is acquired or discovered, and as a way in which we can know what is real. it was an opportunity for me to put research to work to facilitate positive change. And it became a source of dialogue for me as a researcher and my participants. It was one, using participatory video, one that gave me an opportunity to even empower my participants, because I had to train them in using the camera, just the normal, ordinary camera. I went to them. We had different consultations because I was introduced. I got access using, the gatekeepers, so their leaders, those that had a lot of their trust. They gave me the opportunity of engaging with some of these women, and I went to them not as the Western-based researcher. I went to them as a woman. I went to them as a Nigerian, and also as a mother. We sat and we had good conversations. I introduced myself. This is what I'm here for. I explained myself, and then I decided to pass the power back to them. This is what I'm here for, but I want you to decide if you are even interested in this, and I want you to decide how you want the world to see you, how you wish to be represented. There were so many, discussions, and I decided, I trained them in terms of how to use the cameras, and I gave them the opportunity. Sometimes I will be with them, or sometimes, they will get maybe their friends or their daughters, or sons to do the recording. And I gave them the opportunity, and they went out and they came back with a lot, So it is one methodology that I argue is one that gives, an insider perspective, the one that the normal interview will not give you. Because if you give your participants the power, it tends to open up a lot more than you ever expected. And this is what happened to me. It is one that, for those of us that do research and we talk about impact, so we do research not only about the publications, but we want something that will lead to change when we talk about issues to do with development in Africa. So here are policymakers listening to women talking about their issues, calling out directly to the Nigerian state, calling out directly to Shell multinational, for example, in terms of the issues that are affecting them. So they get to hear, the voices directly, not using my own voice. So it is one that is accessible to diverse audiences. And it is one that, remember, policymakers will not sit and read that 10-page journal article, that is highly academic. But if you bring it in a format that is accessible, one that is simple and straight to the point. It could be just a short video clip, a minute, where the woman talks about, or the youth talks about the key issues. It is one that will definitely get their attention, and it is a medium for conveying and influencing decision-making at various levels of policy making, also used by the civil society. And it is a platform for marginalized groups in the society as a voice for the voiceless. And it enables the participants involved, to participate actively in the research. And it is one that is verifiable. It is a documentation that brings in real evidence, not hearsay. So in terms of benefits, decolonial methodologies promote accountability. It makes participation accessible. And like I said, the content is verifiable. Most importantly, it is a community-led process because it mobilizes others. My work with these women groups, although living in the same area, they are not working together. You find out that sometimes some of the communities I visited, are not too far from the state capital. But in terms of access to even international non-governmental organizations, you find that these women groups are even sidelined. Some of them don't even know their rights. So I think when I talk about rights, it's important for me to say, as a Muslim woman, there are arguments sometimes that they say, those of us that are arguing for the voice, giving a voice to the voiceless, it's like we're being accused of it's like we're challenging our religion. And I keep saying to them, no, Islam advocates for the rights of the woman. And I know Islam does not give room for exploitation, for example. Islam did not say any group should be marginalized. Islam says the men should take care of the women, right, my sisters? You see? So these are the issues, that we come across. But I argue that using, a decolonial participatory methodology builds a lot of trust, and it leads to a lot of impact. And the investigations we do create, increase a lot. It creates a lot of awareness, even for the participants that we're working. Because I visited different groups, I have a 25-minute video, but because of ethical issues and it's being recorded, it's not one that I can screen. But another time, if it's not being recorded, I'm happy to come and share, just so you can have a good understanding of, how we use participatory methodologies. But of course, there are ethical issues, There is the issue of positionality of myself as a researcher, and also of representation. Access is always a problem, and we take the issue of security very, very important. For example, I can't, be that ambitious researcher and just go and put myself in the line of fire. No, this is not how it is done. We always get ethical approvals from our institutions before we embark on any research journey. And when we go, for example, I work maybe for between 9 a.m. and by 4 p.m. it's done. And I don't receive invitations to go for interviews maybe in locations I don't even know. So I work with groups that are on ground, that give me some form of intelligence, and they are ones that are aware of my movement. So wherever I move to, they know, just so that I'm able to protect myself, and also to protect my participants. Safety is very, very important, and the issue of confidentiality. So we engage with participants. Sometimes some will say, okay, show me, I don't mind, I'm ready to feature, to appear in the video. But there are those that will say, I'm happy to tell you my story, but only use my voice, don't show my picture. Or some that will even share the information with me and say, this is just for your information, I don't want to feature in this, So sometimes using participatory video is one that opened a lot in terms of sensitive subject matters. I tell you, I came across a lot of issues that, as a woman, as a mother, I had to struggle with myself. For example, when you come across very young girls that have 4 or 5 children, and when I say very young, you see a 12-year-old having a child or maybe 2 children. Because of poverty, they move from one man to another. It is so bad that some of these families even rely on 12-year-old children to provide for the families. So these are some of the issues that I even came across that I didn't expect. And I engaged with even some of those, we have this thing called, because in the Niger Delta is all about the militancy, right? Militants, young men and women taking up arms among the state. But I came across the issue of cultism, so using like cult activities, so much so that so many women have been affected. Some have been raped, not once, not twice, and many of them don't even have the support that they need. So I believe some of the methodologies that I use, I am able to carry some of these confidential information that they want me to carry, but I don't make it accessible to everyone. I go to the target. So if I'm focusing on policymakers, I go directly to the policymakers and I share with them. This is what I have, and this is what I want you, to hear. These are the voices. So there are so many issues that come up when it comes to ethics. So a lot of findings, because they feel they are not treated with, the respect, with the worth that they deserve. And most of those I engaged with are Christians. I remember one of them saying to me that the Bible says the woman is important. And I said to her, yes, my Quran also says the woman is important. She said the cry of the woman is very powerful. So why is it that we are not given a voice? We also have rights. Why are we treated as second-class citizens, So there's this issue of patriarchy. Yes, in Africa, in the Middle East, it is all about the men. And in Islam, yes, there is no argument. The man is, the head of the family. But it should be for some of the arguments that they are raising, because traditional Africa is the man, yes, patriarchy, the men, they take decisions. But all we are saying is that when some of these decisions are taken, please listen to the cries of the women. Listen to them so that you don't take decisions for them. You give them the opportunity to engage with you, to share with you their problems, not just, shutting them down. And I know as a Muslim, some of these issues when we talk about listening, giving a voice to the voiceless, sometimes we are, perceived negatively in the sense that they think we're trying to challenge. No, it is not challenging. We know that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there's no record of him maltreating his wives or his children, or even making the women, become, second class. No, we know, people like Sayyida Aisha, how powerful, her voice has been. Even after the Rasul, we learned a lot from her. We are still studying, when we are studying the Hadith, for example. She will say, this is what the Rasul did, and, So I think when we talk about decolonizing knowledge production, even for us as Muslims, there are a lot of lessons that we have to learn, from the teachings of our Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he never preached, violence, for example. He was one that was very forgiving, okay, and tolerant, and he listened to all. So this is all what, we're arguing. Although my work focuses on the Niger Delta, I'm now engaging, trying to bring together women in the northern part of Nigeria. So in northern part, we talk about issues like Boko Haram, for example, Islamic radicalization. We have the indigenous settler issues, among other things. There's a lot of, lessons to be learned. These local women groups have a lot of stories and strategies to share. So we're trying to bring them together, to engage. And I'm using a theory called vernacular security. And when I say vernacular security, it is nothing out of this world, but more in terms of everyone's voice counts in societies. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to listen to your questions. I hope I did not bore you with a lot of academic jargon. Thank you.
Thank you. We have some time for questions, if there are any questions from either side.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for your talk. I just want to push you a little bit on how this is decolonial rather than just participatory. What's the difference between the two methodologies? It's very obvious that it's very participatory, but how does that make it decolonial?
It is one that it is using participatory video, for example, or storytelling, it is the voice of the woman that is heard, So it is not one that focuses more on the perspectives of myself as a researcher. Okay, I'm African. It is not one that maybe a Western-based scholar, will just write, will summarize, for example, and give his or her own perspective. It is decolonial in the sense that you make it participatory. You give them the power to decide what they want the world to know. So in my work, I give them the power, to decide what they want the world to know. It is not for me to dictate and say, no, this is how I want you. But it's one that, yes, we do edit, but maybe we just edit the noise, but it is their own message that is carried over to wherever I want to go. So when we talk about impact, you carry the voice, and it is not one that has been predetermined, okay, for example. So that is a way of decolonizing knowledge production. They are the ones that are building this knowledge. So it is their own story, the one that is documented, not that of like a Western scholar, for example. And I do have colleagues that are Western scholars that do a lot of research on Africa. And one respect I have for them is that they also use these methodologies. They give power to their participants. It is not only, their voices. So I think I'm happy to say I see some changes, but a lot more has to be done, especially in rethinking, the way knowledge is produced, more in terms of whose voice is being heard. Have I answered your question? Okay.
Thank you. I'm next. Thank you very much for the fantastic work and research that you do. My question is about identity. So a lot of your work focuses on Africa. But when we think of Africa in that way, not as a geographical place, but as an entity with its own identity, we're speaking of Africa as a homogeneous place without really appreciating that it's a whole world in itself with its own diversity. We're speaking of Africa in a way that we would never speak of Europe. You would never have a slide, for example, that says Europe findings, this kind of society in Europe, because we know Europe's so diverse. So do you worry that the focus on Africa as an entity sometimes can play into the colonial narrative a little bit?
Yes, I think going back to what we call the Berlin Conference, during the time when, the Western powers, the colonial masters sat down and decided to just, divide Africa, irrespective of, the complexities, the differences. In the process, they tried to push, they pushed so many people together and they formed so many borders in Africa. So yes, Africa is a world on its own. There are different groups in Africa. There are arguments about, the way Africa is portrayed. I know Africa is not a homogeneous society, and we argue that even sometimes we argue that the colonial masters, even though they've gone, so they are no more the colonial masters, but they still wield a lot of power in terms of the way things are being done in Africa. So yes, Africa is independent, but so many countries rely on their former colonialists in terms of policy making. For example, France is one that is guilty of that. Even Britain is guilty of that. Most of them, because France in particular is not one that stands to watch if something is happening in its former colonies. And Belgium recently, I think I heard in the news just 2-3 days ago, they visited the DRC and they returned some of the stolen goods, So yes, Africa is not one, but the borders that were created during the colonial era is one that is guilty in terms of leading to a lot of conflicts even in Africa. And sometimes because I teach African politics, so I say to my students, perhaps we should be asking the African leaders, why is it that at independence they had the opportunity, There were talks to try, and people like Kwame Nkrumah tried bringing together, the whole of Africa so that it would be one Africa, okay? But the fact that each country was, going through a different, process of independence. So even at that time, there was no agreement in terms of coming together to have one Africa. And that was what people like Nkrumah argued for. But recently, there are calls in terms of going back, to the issue of Pan-Africanism, trying to bring Africa together. But it is very difficult because there are so many issues, so many conflicts going on in Africa, and that is very difficult for everyone to come together and say, yes, we have one voice. They are trying, but still there are issues. So Africa is not, it would be difficult to maybe make it one that everybody is on board. You find out there are issues. Go to South Africa, for example. You go to South Africa, even after independence, the issue of apartheid is there. You go to South Africa, you see clearly the division, the division between the whites and the blacks. You see poverty. You see in one area, if you are in Johannesburg, for example, it's like you're in Europe in some of the areas. But just move a little to the shanty towns and you see Africans, the rightful owners of the land are being, treated in a different way. So there are so many issues. A lot of work needs to be done. both by our leaders, but I think it is a task on all of us that are Africans, irrespective of where you are.
Thank you very much. Sister, I was just trying to ask, but before that, about this question. You know, they have divided Africa into MENA, which is Middle East and North Africa. So most of the Arab countries, North African countries, are not part of Africa. Until the apartheid regime, South Africa was part of the West, not of Africa in terms of World Bank and IMF and so on. So yes, they have some borders, and we have some borders, of course. But what I'm trying to say is that, what do you think was the influence of, I know you mentioned Nkrumah and others, of people like Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Usman Sembène, Nuruddin Farah, these sort of fiction writers who bring the same idea of decolonizing the African heritage. And also lately, people like Alex Haley and so on, who brought a different perspective onto African thinking. Has that percolated down to ordinary people? And the last one is that in your participatory research, I suspect that probably your methodology does overcome the lack of literacy among some of these participants. Because they don't need to be literate to talk to you. But if you ask them to write or do something, then that would be a hindrance for some of them. So some observations on that, please.
Okay. Thank you about the methodology. I think it's encouraging that you say that, because they are not writing, they are talking. So it is their voice, that is being carried. And in terms of, the literary writers, studying in Africa, we studied, African writers. So we read Chinua Achebe, among others, Wole Soyinka. And people like Soyinka, he still argues, that Africa has always existed. Africa is a powerhouse, So it is not for someone to tell us that there is no place for Africa. Of course, Africa is, that rich source of information. And I think there is no decline, because we see more African writers now coming up, telling the story, but using, language is also a problem. So the medium, for example, in Nigeria, it's in English, okay? So perhaps translating some of these to the local African language will be important. Or perhaps even, using storytellers to tell the stories that some of these writers are, talking about. People like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for example, are very powerful forces when it comes to all these things. But I think language is important here. Although, there are arguments in terms of decolonizing the mind, so freeing the mind from control and domination, to a large extent, there's still a lot of control because of the use of language. Okay? So I think that is for Western education. But when we come to Islamic education, for example, there is only one Quran, okay? And it is written in Arabic. And we all, those of us that are able to learn, are able to read it in Arabic. But as against knowledge when it comes to, former colonial territories, the focus is like on a foreign language. But although maybe we can say Arabic language is also foreign in countries like Africa, but then it is one that, because it is religious, it is one that we make that deliberate effort to learn. And the division between the, sub-Saharan Africa and the MENA region is one. I know when I teach, I say to my students, I teach one Africa. I don't distinguish between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, for example. So when we talk about African leaders, we talk about people like Gaddafi, for example. We don't say Gaddafi is maybe only part of the MENA region. So I think these distinctions, are very important, and also South Africa, Southern Africa as a whole, countries also like Namibia, were under, foreign domination for a longer period compared to countries like Ghana. So I think African scholars, I think we need to make more deliberate and conscious effort in trying to see how we tell the stories, but using our own voices or even voices of people based in Africa. So people based in, the area. So when I teach, for example, if I talk about, Rwanda, I talk about the genocide. What I do during the seminars is that I bring in, people that have lived through the Rwandan conflict, some of the survivors, and they come and engage with my students. So yes, we have reading lists, for example, where a lot, are even Western scholars, some of them are Africans. But the difference we're trying to make is we give the students the opportunities. These are the readings, the Western-based, the African-based, but then in terms of the knowledge, we bring in that voice, from Africa to come and engage with the students so that they have the opportunity of asking the questions and getting the answers directly. And it is up to them now to go back and form, their own knowledge and perception of Africa. I don't know if I've answered your question, brother.
You must have seen the works of people like Mazrui.
Yeah, Ali Mazrui.
And Gates on the whole of African perspective overall.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no, that's fine.
Yeah, especially his documentary, The Africans, Ali Mazrui, is one that I refer to my students. I tell them, want to know about Africa, those of you that are Africans, but, born and bred here, in the UK, for example, watch The Africans by Ali Mazrui. Because, he tells that story, that rich cultural heritage of Africa, which is very empowering.
Thank you very much. It's already prayer time. So inshallah, if there are, I know a couple of questions still people want to ask. Maybe they can ask you after prayers if that's okay. We'll finish there. So salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Just a reminder that next week we have the art of recitation, Quranic melodies by Sayyid Jalal Masumi, and the week after we have Tawassul and intercession in Muslim thought by Rida Jishi. Look on sikkim.org.uk for more of our programs. Sallallahu alaihi Muhammad.